these might be the best example of, automotive product advertising ever. I'm Patrick Laughlin, Chief Operating Officer for iProv. Today we're going to take another look at some classic ads, this time from Volkswagen. But before we get into that, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and hit the bell button too, so you make sure that you get the latest videos when you log into YouTube. First up is a classic ad from Volkswagen, like we talked about earlier, with maybe like one of the most iconic sort of counterculture figures from the late 60s and early 70s, Dustin Hoffman. What's funny is that Dustin Hoffman actually made Alfa Romeo famous in The Graduate, but it turns out he was a really great pitchman for Volkswagen. Let's take a look.
If you've never bought a Volkswagen because it wasn't big enough, okay. Here's a Volkswagen that's big enough. The new VW Fastback sedan. It seats 4 with more room for elbows and legs. It's pretty jazzy, too. Has an electric clock and even wall-to-wall carpeting. The Fastback also has the most powerful engine we've ever made. It's air-cooled. Goes 27 miles on a gallon of gas, which is pretty good for a car that can go 84 miles per hour. Since we made a VW that's a little roomier in the inside, we decided to do the same thing on the outside. It's got a trunk up front where most cars have their motors. And in the back, where most cars have their trunks, we have it's a trunk, a large trunk. Come into your Volkswagen dealer. He'll show you where the motor is.
So what's really interesting about car ads from this era, especially foreign car ads like Volkswagen and some Honda and some Toyota ads from this era, is that they were cars that were almost anti-American in terms of everything. The way they were produced, the size of the vehicle, the horsepower, etc. You got to remember, this was a time of American muscle. It's interesting that they used Dustin Hoffman in this ad, because Dustin Hoffman was sort of a representative of the counterculture, but he was a safe representative. He's in a suit and tie. He's not in jeans and a t-shirt like, a hippie. At the same time, he's a representative of a brand new generation of car buyers. You sort of think about that time in history. It's about 25 years removed from World War II. This is when, people had been coming back from the war. There was a whole lot of anti-German and anti-Japanese sentiment from that generation. But their kids didn't necessarily carry that on. And in fact, they were looking for things that were anti whatever their mom and dad believed, right? Well, that boiled down into consumer goods like cars. And so now this next generation that maybe isn't feeling as prosperous or as American as their parents was looking for something that they could identify with. And things like Volkswagen or things like the small cars from Japan made a whole lot of sense. There was also a burgeoning environmental movement. So you notice that they mentioned miles per gallon.
Goes 27 miles on a gallon of gas.
That's something that, believe me, no American car company at the time advertised. What's really interesting is that, Dustin Hoffman is not a typical Hollywood leading man or pitch man. He never has been. He's sort of this quirky, goofy guy. And in the minds of most car buyers at the time, Volkswagens were sort of quirky, goofy cars. He was a perfect fit. But if you listen carefully to the copy, you'll notice that he's hitting on all the major buying points. It's fuel efficient. It's got lots of space, so you really only need one of these things. You don't need a station wagon like your mom has, and you don't need some lead sled like your dad's driven for the last 20 years, because this thing goes 84 miles an hour too. And there's plenty of room to put all your friends and all your gear in it. Really love this commercial. I think it goes a long way towards, let's call it de-Germanizing the brand. Let's never forget that Volkswagen is the people's car from the Nazis. That's its birth. It was the Beetle in particular was meant to be a car that anyone in Germany could afford during the Nazi regime. And that's a pretty hard stigma to get over. And we're going to look at how Volkswagen did that in their print ads next. One of the things that Volkswagen did a fantastic job of, especially in the late 50s and the early 60s, to sort of de-Nazi their brand, was a series of print ads. Really famous art director, a guy named Helmut Krohn, was the one that led up these ads, and they're still legendary today. There are lots of people in our business that study these ads and say, these might be the best example of, automotive product advertising ever. It's because they were clever. They focused on one feature and benefit at a time in each ad, and they were so different from every other ad that was out at the time. One big image in the ad, and the messages were always sort of clever, and they just sucked into your attention. This one in particular I like. We made the car go faster and the engine go slower. One of the things that was interesting about Volkswagens were they were air-cooled, and they were not complicated engines. You can literally take the engine out of the back of a Volkswagen Beetle just by undoing 4 bolts. Next up, this is something that a lot of modern cars talk about, sort of the modularity, and everybody's used to, if I bump into something, I just get my bumper replaced, right? Cars weren't always built that way. Like, if you got into some sort of wreck, you might replace half the car. And so the next ad talks about you don't have to replace half the car. If you have a little fender bender or something, once again, Volkswagens are simple to work on. If you got a simple set of hand tools, you can fix most things. You can pull off the bumper, you can replace the headlight. It's just a couple simple bolts, and all you need is some hand tools. That's pretty revolutionary for its time. So the next one up is maybe the most famous ad in sort of print from the 60s, maybe the most famous automotive ad ever. It's the Think Small ad. What's interesting is the other campaigns that came much later that sort of played off of this idea of putting yourself in a box, right? Now advertisers and marketers have all of this sophisticated audience data, but back then you had to sort of pick some publications to put things in that you thought matched your audience, and then let your audience self-select your brand. It was a very different way to think. The idea that all these other big car manufacturers of the time made these huge, giant cars. I mean, think about the Ford Mustang in the 60s. That was considered a small car for the time. And then here comes this tiny little Volkswagen Beetle that's, about 2/3 the size of a Ford Mustang. This is a really small car. And one of the things that Volkswagen had to sort of fight against was that it was unsafe, or that it wasn't going to go fast, or that it wouldn't be reliable because it was a small car. Because for years, people had been told that bigger is better. Not always. The next one, and the last one that we're going to talk about today, is an ad from Volkswagen that says, don't let the price scare you off. Volkswagens were cheap. They were really cheap cars to buy. They were really cheap cars to own. They just didn't require much. If you're used to spending a lot of money on a car, you automatically equate price with quality. What Volkswagen was trying to tell you was price and quality are not always paired together. I think that these are some of the best ads ever produced. Certainly some of the best ads produced from the era. Incredible brand building, lasts a long time. That's the real message to take away from this, is that even a setback as big as World War II and an association with the Nazis can still be overcome by a good marketing message. So there's a lot to like and a lot that we can learn from some of these classic ads. Tell me what you learned down in the comments. I'd love to see what you took away from this video, and maybe I missed something that you think is important that we should talk about. If you need help with your ads, don't be afraid to reach out and contact us at iprovonline.com. Thanks. Thanks for showing up. Oh, I forgot how we end these things.
Yeah, so...
Oh. Sorry. No, that's not I'm not worried about my head. I'm worried about your mic.